Hey, this is Michael from Arc Smarter, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how you can use Dynamo to create a link between Revit and Excel. And what's really cool about this is that you can actually create a two-way link. So using the Dynamo graph, you can extract your data from Revit into Excel, and then you can modify your data in Excel, and then again using the same Dynamo graph, bring it back into your Revit model. So I'm working in Revit version 2016, and you can use any version, 2014 or 2015. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to be using Dynamo version 0.8. Now, if you're not familiar with Dynamo, Dynamo is an open source software that is associated with Autodesk, and they've actually created a Dynamo Studio version that allows you to work with Dynamo, not necessarily with Revit. However, you can actually download the open source version. I mean, if you go to dynamobim.org, and it's free. You can download it and installs, and you can run it directly from Revit. If you want some more information, there's actually a recently released Dynamo Primer version 1, and this is great. This walks you through everything you need to know about Dynamo if you're curious about it or if you want to get started using it. So in this tutorial, though, what we're going to look at, again, is creating that link between Revit and Excel. So I'm going to go up to the add-ins ribbon, and you can see I have Dynamo installed, and I'm just going to click on that to launch it. It'll launch in a separate window in just a second. And essentially Dynamo is a visual programming environment. So rather than typing code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use nodes that I can just grab from my screen, and then I more or less assemble my program, or in Dynamo as it's called, a graph, graphically, and then I create links and do all sorts of cool stuff. So here's the Dynamo window. I'm just going to go on, click on New to create a new graph. And you can see this is what pops up. I have more or less a 3D view here. And this is really my graph editor. And I can switch between graph mode and 3D mode if I'm actually creating geometry. And on the left-hand side, this is where I have access to all of my nodes. And pretty much rather than, like I said, writing code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these elements and assemble them. So for our example today, maximize this. What we're going to be doing is we're going to get all of our rooms in our current Revit model, and then we're going to export them out to Excel. So my first step is I want to get the rooms. And in order to do this, I'm going to have to start with the room category in Revit. And there's a couple ways I can navigate and find that particular node. I can go through here, and if I know exactly what I'm looking for, I can just click the icon. In this case, I'm going to go down to Revit, Elements, and what I'm looking for is a node called Categories. So I can also, though, if I know exactly what I'm looking for, I can just type into the search window, and you can see it comes up here. Here's a node called Categories, and I just double click on it. And then, oops, I actually want to single click, otherwise I get two. But that's my node right there. And so from this node, I can just click the drop down, and I'm going to look for the categories called Rooms. I can click the keyboard to get it, but you can see these are all the categories that are available in Revit, and it's in here somewhere. Here we go, Rooms. So now that I have the rooms, what I want to do is I want to get all the elements of that category. So I'm going to do a quick search for another node, and finding nodes and knowing what nodes to use is something that you get experience with the more you use Dynamo. So starting off, it feels like a little bit like a hide and seek, and you're trying to find exactly what you want. But with some practice, and this is the same thing with coding as well, you start to understand the logic of how that environment works. So in this case, the node I want is called All Elements of Category. Now let me just keep, and you can see as I search, it pulls it up. Got an extra one here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a link between the nodes. And you can see in my first node under categories, on the right-hand side, there's a little piece of text here that says category. Now on my all elements of category, there's a piece of text on the left that says category and on the right that says elements. And so these are essentially my input and outputs for the node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my categories node, and I just click on it where it says category, and then I get this dashed line here, and then I can connect that to the category input of the all elements of category node, and I click on that. So essentially I've created a link between the two nodes. So what I can do here, just to test things out, is I'm going to insert a watch node. And I click that, and then I'm going to just connect that to the elements output. And you can see when I do that, all of a sudden I have these rooms pop up. And right now I have Dynamo set to run automatically. I'm going to just change that to run manually, and you'll see that gives me the run button. So anytime I want to run my graph, I just click the button. So in my watch node, you can see there's 6 rooms that are showing up. So let me switch back to Revit real quick. Okay. And here's my model. And like I said, this is a very simple model, but I have 6 rooms in here. So it's actively pulling the room data in through Dynamo. So let's switch back to my graph. So the first step was to get the rooms. Now what I want to do is I want to get some parameter data out of those rooms. So for example, in this case, what I want to do is get the room number and the room name. So I can use another node that's called get parameter value by name. And I'm just going to type element because I'm taking it from an element. And you can see here it pulls up in the search. And so I'm going to need one of these each, for one for rooms and then one for room name and then one for room number. So I can select a node, and if I type Control C and then Control V, I can paste it. I can just make a copy of that. So in this get parameter value by name node, you can see that it accepts 2 inputs on the left-hand side. So I need to provide it with an element and then a parameter name. And what it will do is it will spit out a variable this is essentially in a list. But first, let's provide it with the right inputs. So I have my elements here from all elements of category. I'm passing that through my watch node, and I can just connect that watch node into the get parameter value by name input. And a lot of times with nodes, I can have a single node go to multiple nodes. So again, I want to get, I'm getting 2 different parameter names, but I'm using the same input elements. Now, I also need to provide a parameter name. So exactly what parameter am I trying to extract from those elements? And in this case, the parameter name input is a string. So all it's going to be is a piece of text. So let me go back up to my search window, and I'm going to type string. Oops, create an extra one. And now I'm just going to connect these to the parameter name field. So once they're connected, what I can do is if I click on the node, I can type in my string or my piece of text. And so what I want to do is I want to get the name parameter, and then I want to get the number parameter. So if I click run, you can see everything looks pretty much the same. If I were to get an error, for instance, if I were to change, say, name to a bunch of gibberish, and then I click run, sometimes you'll get an actual error. So it'll show up, and we'll see some throughout the course, but they'll show up as a yellow. It's hard to miss them. So I'm going to type this back to name. And then on the right-hand side of my node, there's a little checkbox here. And if I click that down, I can actually get sort of like a built-in watch value. So you can see that it's actually giving me a list of 5 values here. So now that I'm getting some parameters, and actually let's do this. Let's copy. I'm going to make another watch, and I'm just going to connect it here so we can actually see if we're getting the room names. So what it's outputting is I'm getting a list of room. So let's look at our Revit model real quick. And you can see that my room names actually they're just default Revit room objects. I haven't updated the names. And so the rooms are, in fact, just listed as room. So it looks like in Dynamo, it's pretty accurate. So it's getting the rooms, it's getting the room names and the room numbers. So we have those values. What we need to do, and one thing that Dynamo works a lot with, is with lists. So essentially, I've taken all of the room elements, I've extracted the name parameter and the number parameter. And what I want to do is I want to create a list of those 2 values and put them together. And ultimately, this is what we're going to insert into Excel. So I'm just going to type list in the search box. And what I'm looking for is the list.create node. And here it is. And this can take any number of inputs. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my list of room names and I'm going to take my list of room numbers and I'm going to put them together into a single list. So let's connect these bits here. And I'm going to give it a run. And you can see now that it's created two lists and they're separated. So one of the room numbers, one of the room names. What I need to do now is I need to join those lists so that it's associating the room number and the room name together as they're coming out of the elements of category. So essentially that will create a link and it'll say that this room name is associated to this room number. So the node I'm going to use to do that is called a list transpose. And I click on that. And I'm going to take the list that I just created and then run it through the transpose node. Now, when I'm working in Dynamo, if I want to pan, I can just use my middle mouse button. It's real easy. And if I want to zoom in and out, I just use my roller ball. So I can move around and I can go and zoom in on different parts of my graph pretty easily. So what I'll do is I'll just run this again. And you can see, let me zoom in here. So I created my list using my two other lists, and then using list transpose, I just associated the lists together. So I have a room that's associated with a room number all the way down for all my rooms. And that looks like that's pretty accurate. So right now, I have the rooms, I have the parameter values. What I want to do is I want to write them to Excel. So I'm going to use a node that's called, this is a standard Dynamo node called Excel write file. Let's take a quick look at that. And you can see it has a number of things for the input. So it's going to take the file path, then I insert the particular sheet name, the start row, start column, and then the actual data. So to start with, what I want to do is I want to create the file path. And I can use a special node called file path to do that. Sorry, there's not a space there. And this is actually a pretty cool node because, where did it go? Here you go. So I can actually browse for my file. So I click on the browse and it just gives me a standard open dialog box. And I'm going to go to my documents and I'm going to create, actually I'm just going to dump this. That should work. And I'm going to call it Revit Excel test. And so that's the file that I'm going to use. Now I can also create or I can specify the sheet name that I'm going to use. And so in this case, this is going to be a string. And so if I had a particular sheet name that I wanted this data to go into, I can specify this. Otherwise, I'm just going to enter this as sheet 1, which is the standard Excel sheet. And then also I can specify my start row and start column. So if I highlight over those, this is showing me that it accepts an integer as the value. An integer is the same as a number. So I'm going to pull out a number node. And I'm going to set my start row to be 0 and then my start column to be 0 as well. So this will insert the data starting in the upper left, the very first cell in the upper left corner. Now the last thing I need to input is the data itself. So in this case, what I do is I just go down to my list transpose node, and this has the data associated the way I want, and then I just connect that to the data input. Now I'm going to just give this a run, and you can see Dynamo is thinking, it's actually doing something, and it's opening Excel as it does that. And you can see here, it input the values exactly as they should. So in the left hand, in column A, I have my room names, and then in column B, I have my room numbers. So let me close this for a second, and I'm just going to save my graph just on my desktop. And I'm going to switch back to Revit. And what I want to do is I want to see what happens if I change one of my room numbers. So let's just change, one of my room names, and change this to office. And I'll change this one to office as well. Okay, so just modified that. And I'm going to go back to Dynamo. And I'm going to rerun this. Excel opens up again, and you can see that it did in fact update it. So now it's exporting the data exactly as it is in the Revit model at that time. So my first two offices that I changed, first two rooms that I changed to office, it picked up those changes, which is great. So this works out well. It's an easy way to get Revit data out to Excel, and I'm using Dynamo as the way to do that. Now, what happens if I want to actually take that data, modify it in Excel, and then bring it back into Revit? So I can use this same graph to do that. Now, what I'm going to do though is I'm going to create some new nodes. And the first one, what I want to do is sort of reverse the way that this graph is flowing. So I want to start with reading the data from Excel, and then I'll work out to setting the values. So the node that I want is called Excel Read from File. And I click on that. And here we go. And I can reuse a lot of the nodes that I have. So in this case, I have a file input, and then I have a sheet name. So for the sheet name, I can use the same one that I'm using here to write the file. I'm just going to connect that. And you can see after a while when you work with Dynamo, you do end up with all of these connectors kind of all over the place. So it takes a little bit while to get used to it, and it can look a little bit messy. So you'll see when we finish that, we're going to have a lot of these connectors going all over the place. Now, one thing to note about this read from file node is that it's a little bit different from the write to file node in that it doesn't accept a file path. What it accepts is a file name instead. So I can still use my file path node to specify it. I just need to translate the data that's coming out of that file path node into a slightly different format. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a file.fromPath node. And I click on that. So this accepts a path, and then it converts it into a file object. So I'll connect my file path, and then I connect that through to the node itself. One thing to note, if you hover over the nodes, a lot of times it'll give you some information exactly about how to use that node, which is pretty helpful. So I'm going to read from my file. So I'm reading the data specifically, and as the data is coming out, it's actually putting that into a list format. So once I read the data, what I want to do is, again, I want to separate it because it's going to be reading it row by row. So like we did before when we were exporting our data and we had to use the list transpose, I want to reverse that process. So I'm just going to select my list transpose node. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it over here and reconnect it. So let's do a quick test. Now, in order to do the test, what I need to do is I'm going to disconnect my write to file node. So I'm going to just disconnect the data element. So now I'm not going to be writing the data to Excel, but I will be reading it. And I'm going to give this a run. And you can see I did get some errors here. If I click on that, it's telling me that the operation failed because the file path was not found. So let's browse, and let's make sure that we're getting the right file. And actually what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to close my Excel so that this works better. I'm going to go to my documents, and let's search for it. Test. Okay. We open it, and let's give it another run. Okay, so it looks like I just needed to make that connection a little bit more explicit to the node. So it's reading the data, it's coming in. I can minimize this, and let's click this down, and you can say through my list transpose node, it's actually separated out the room names from the new room numbers. So that looks like it's working great. So the next step, just to reiterate, we've actually been able to read from Excel now. And what we want to do is we want to get the actual parameter values. And then we're going to use those values and then set them back into the room objects. So what I want to do now that I have my list and I have it sorted the right way is I want to be able to specify exactly the value that I want to get from the list. So I'm going to use the list.getValue, get item at index. And I'm going to create 2 copies of these, one for the rooms, one for the room names and one for the room numbers. So I'm going to take my list, I'm going to split it, and then you'll see the input for this node is an index, which is essentially a number. So I'm just going to get a number node. Now, if I were doing this by writing it as code, essentially I would just declare my variable, and then I would feed it into a function. So with Dynamo, I'm actually creating the node, and then I'm feeding the node into another node. Conceptually, it's the same. It's just the operation that since I'm dealing with objects, it's a little bit different. So in this case, up top, we'll say that this is going to be our room numbers, and then on the bottom, this node will use that as our room names. So if I look at my list here, the first part, the index 0 of the list is my room names, and then index 1 is my room numbers. So I'm going to set this to be 1. Let me copy that node, and I'm going to set the value of this to be 0. And let's run that and just double check. And you can see here, it's separated out. So I have room numbers going through this node on the bottom. Room names on the bottom, room numbers on the top. So I've separated them out, and now essentially I want to set those parameters back into the rooms. So I'm going to use a node called setParameterByName. And I'm going to create 2 of these. And the input on this node is an element, the parameter name, and then the actual value. So the value is going to be what we're getting out of our lists. The parameter name is going to be a string that I specify. So let me just get 2 string nodes. And in this case, they're going to be straightforward. It's just essentially the same string names that I was using to get the parameter values. So I want name here, and then I want number up top. So I've set the new values, I've set the parameter that I want to update. Now I just need to feed it with the actual elements that I'm going to be updating. And now I can go back all the way over to the very beginning where I selected all the elements of the category room. And I'm just going to feed this into the node. And I can do this same thing here. It's the same set of elements. So I'm going to run this, and it's telling me the storage type is not a number. Now, one thing that I found with Dynamo is that occasionally it acts or behaves a little bit funny. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my graph here. And I'm just going to close Dynamo, and I'm going to reopen it. And then I'll just reload my graph. And I found that sometimes this actually, the connection between Revit and Dynamo sometimes gets a little funny. So I find that restarting Dynamo helps a lot, especially if you're getting errors that you shouldn't be getting. Okay, so let's run that again. Okay, and it's still giving me an error, and I think I know why. So what I'm going to do, this is on my room number. And in Excel, I'm going to go through, and I'm just going to change the value of this column here. And I'm going to set that to be text. So I think, okay, now I'm going to save my file. And what I'm also going to do is, let's say I want to update, my room numbers and my room names. I don't feel like going through and doing them manually. So I'm going to just do it here in Excel. Let's call this Office 01, Office 02, Office 03, Let's break room, give myself a little bit more space here in Excel. Corridor, I think, is more appropriate. Break room. And let's change our room numbers. Let's do 101, 102. And this is where actually Excel is really useful because I can highlight these 3 cells, and then I can drag down and it will increment them automatically. Now I'm going to save the Excel file. I'm going to go back into Dynamo, and I'm going to run my graph. And let's take a look. And you can see here that it actually did update this all to everything that was in the Excel file. If I go back to Excel and I say, well, let's change some of these things. Library, and if we wanted to 101A, however we want to change these room numbers, I can just do that straight away. Save Excel, back into Revit. I'm going to switch over to Dynamo, and I'm going to give this another run. And let's check this again. And you can see it updated everything according to everything that I had set up in my Excel file. Let's take a look. You can see here I have a little bit of a mistake. So let me change this to 105A, 106A. Save it. Back to Dynamo. Rerun it. Still giving me that error, but it's actually updating everything correctly. So this is a real simple example, but it shows you how easy it is using Dynamo as a way to create that link. And again, I think what's interesting and what's pretty cool about this is that link is two-way. So I can use it, the same graph, with a little bit of modification to export my data and then to import my data. And I'm just using rooms here as an example, but you can see using my categories and all elements of categories, I could pretty much do this to any Revit object. As long as I know what the parameter names are, I can pull their values out into Excel, modify them in Excel, and then put them back in. So I have a lot of flexibility in working with my Revit data. I hope this was useful. I hope you learned something here about Dynamo. And if you have any questions, you can always email me at michael@spacecmd.com. Thanks.